Welcome to our Natural Habitat Adventures presentation today, Discover Hidden Yellowstone, presented today by Aaron Bott. Aaron has worked as a naturalist, an interpretive wildlife specialist, and backcountry wilderness guide for more than a dozen years. His expertise includes the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, and the Colorado Plateau. His knowledge of these territories is exceptional, and his skills as a communicator and educator are invaluable. As a graduate student at Utah State University, Aaron is studying wildlife and large carnivore management and conservation. He is keenly aware of the complex biopolitics surrounding predatory species such as wolves, grizzlies, and cougars, and it's his ambition to educate the public and help integrate better science and policies that will preserve North American megafauna for centuries to come. Aaron lives with his wife and son in Utah, which is where he is broadcasting from today. And we are just so delighted to be here with you, Aaron. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me, and welcome to all of the listeners who are participating. To begin with, I'd like to start out with a quote by the poet and author Robinson Jeffers. But the wolf's tooth whittled so fine the fleet limbs of the antelope. I think that that's an excellent theme for today's presentation as we talk about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and this wonderful trip that Natural Habitat provides during the spring and summer and early fall months in this region. This is a fantastic photograph actually taken by a trail camera or a trap camera set up by a National Geographic photographer, Denovan, who worked out of the Yellowstone and did a great project focusing on the backcountry usage of wildlife in the Yellowstone ecosystem, as well as some of the migration routes. Firstly, I'd like to again thank Natural Habitat Adventures, the official traveling partner of the World Wildlife Fund, for putting this trip together. If you're new to Natural Habitat Adventures, or if you're just learning about it today, I think it's important to point out that the World Wildlife Fund and Natural Habitat Adventures work together to provide global ecotourism that helps support the regions where visitors and travelers like to explore. So particularly in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and just north up onto the Great Plains, the World Wildlife Fund, which has a regional office in Bozeman, is working with Natural Habitat Adventures to preserve some of the habitat and the wildlife species that I'm going to talk about today. So I just wanted to bring that up and express gratitude where thanks is due. Yellowstone is situated in the northwest corner of Wyoming, and part of the park actually extends into Montana and Idaho as well. About 96% belongs in Wyoming. Yellowstone is the world's first national park, and today, just to give you an outline of the presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about the ecology of the area as well as some of the trip's more important details. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the deep history, some of the geology of the area, some of the human history, and then, of course, the natural history of this region. And I think that this is, in my opinion, the most spectacular place on Earth. I had the wonderful privilege of growing up just 2 miles outside of Yellowstone National Park and 5 miles out of Grand Teton National Park. So these two wonderful areas of preservation were in my backyard, and I kind of grew up spoiled, not realizing that every kid had moose and bears in their backyards. So this area is close to my heart, and I am excited to share some of the cooler facts with you guys today. This presentation is just a teaser trailer. Natural Habitat Adventures is Hidden Yellowstone trip is 7 days, and on this trip you actually will have one or two guides that are experts in this ecosystem, and they will have so much knowledge and passion to share with you. So I do consider this presentation to be kind of an extended teaser trailer of what the trip has to offer. If nothing else, it's here to pique your curiosity, and if you have any questions specifically, again, you can type those in and we'll get to some of those at the end. Right here on this map, you can see in the center Yellowstone National Park as a part of the Northern Rocky Mountains. A lot of folks are familiar with the Southern Rockies in Colorado. The Northern Rockies extends really with the Wind River Range and the Salt Range up through the Tetons, through the Absarokas and the Gallatin Range, all the way up into the Northwest Territories of Canada. The tallest peaks in this entire cordillera, this entire mountain range, are found in the Yellowstone ecosystem, the Grand Teton being the second tallest, and the tallest being actually found in the Wind River Range. These are the Tetons. I worked, as was mentioned, actually in the Teton National Park for a number of years as a backcountry and wilderness guide climbing these peaks. They are the most iconic peaks in the United States, in my opinion, and many people would agree with me. What makes them so spectacular is the amount of relief that extends from the valley at about 6,000 feet to the very tallest point at the top of the Grand Teton there in the center at 13,770 feet. This incredible relief allows for no montane foothills, and so you get quite a spectacular vista. The trip is actually based out of Jackson Hole, which is kind of a Hollywood tourist mecca at the base of the mountain. It's a ski resort town, and it's got a lot of charisma and really fun culture and activities that are offered there. And the park goes from the Teton Range into Yellowstone National Park. This is the lower falls of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. That incredible waterfall is one of the destination points on the trip at over 308 feet above the Yellowstone River. So this trip is basically moving from south to north and then south again. I'll show a slide right here that kind of gives you a rough idea of where this trip begins, where you're going to be staying, and where you're going to end up. So that bottom star is a rough indicator of Jackson Hole. I should say that Jackson Hole was actually named after a trapper in the 1830s named David E. Jackson, and a hole refers to a valley between mountain ranges. So Jackson Hole, Jackson is the famous destination point where we will start our trip. We will spend time traveling and exploring the Teton Mountains, and we will eventually work our way up along Jackson Lake through the south gate of Yellowstone National Park. We will spend time at Old Faithful, which is that middle star, and then we will move our way up into the Lamar Valley and stay potentially, depending on your itinerary, in Cooke City. Cooke City is that topmost star. Lamar Valley is known as the Serengeti of North America, with a high concentration of wildlife, and we'll talk a lot about that. You can see that there are some detours on my map, and that just goes to show some of the other destination points that are offered. Exploration of Hayden Valley, as well as Yellowstone Lake and the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. And ultimately the trip will backtrack and we'll finish in Jackson Hole, where the trip started. Yellowstone National Park is 2.2 million acres. The Grand Teton National Park is sitting over 240,000 acres. It is, as I mentioned, the world's first national park. It was established March 1st in 1872 under the Ulysses S. Grant administration. And we'll talk a little bit about the interesting history of the park, but you can see by looking at this map and identifying the park boundaries that it's pretty rectangular. In fact, when the park was first created, it was perfectly rectangular. Since that time, we've added and subtracted in some regions of the area, but we as humans like to create arbitrary boundaries around things that we think are special. And sadly, Yellowstone National Park did not include the Teton Range or some of the other spectacular areas surrounding the present-day boundaries, including the Absaroka Mountains and the Gallatins and the Gros Ventres and the Wind Rivers. So what we have come to do, or come to claim, I guess, is that Yellowstone National Park is the park, but we often refer to this area as the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, or the Greater Yellowstone Area. And you'll hear me refer to that a lot. Yellowstone National Park, as I mentioned, has just over 2 million acres, but the ecosystem, depending on who's defining it, has between 16 and 22 million acres. I do like to point out that as a biologist studying wildlife, it's exciting to see how quickly we are advancing in terms of our understanding of natural history and ecology. Ecosystems and ecology, even as terms, were coined just in the 20th century. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that it wasn't too long ago, just in the 1960s and 70s, when we actually began to realize that wildlife needed more than just a rectangular national park to be preserved. These animals move in between park boundaries and state boundaries, and this entire ecosystem is home to the wildlife that I will be discussing. So while we are actually visiting Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park, I'm just going to refer to this entire region as the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Now, if you are not familiar with Yellowstone's geology, maybe I can at least spark your interest by mentioning that Yellowstone is an active volcano. It is a supervolcano, actually. It is the largest supervolcano on any continent on Earth. Underneath Yellowstone is what's known as a hotspot, a large thermal plume which extends from the mantle of the Earth up into the crust and creates magma chambers, which are quite enormous, enough so to elevate the landscape and create an incredibly large plateau. Yellowstone's average elevation above sea level is 8,000 feet. And this incredible thermal plume in this magma chamber is superheating saline groundwaters, which are responsible for all of the hydrothermal activities that we see, the geysers like Old Faithful and the hot springs like the Grand Prismatic Pool. Yellowstone has the highest concentration of geothermal features on Earth and the highest concentration of geysers on Earth. And all of this is due to its very violent history as a volcano. Hotspots are found elsewhere on Earth. Iceland is one area. The Hawaiian Islands, of course, are a chain of islands created by a hotspot. And Yellowstone has erupted in its current location in northwestern Wyoming 3 times in the last 2.1 million years. So as far as we can tell, as the continents drift, Yellowstone's hotspot has actually erupted over several dozen times, perhaps over a couple hundred times in the last 16.5 million years, starting out in the Oregon-Nevada boundary and working its way east to present-day Yellowstone in northwestern Wyoming. Just to give you a grand scale of how violent these eruptions are, the first eruption, which took place 2.1 million years ago in Yellowstone's present location, was about 2,500 times more violent than the eruption of Mount St. Helens. That should tell you exactly how devastating this type of eruption can be. And this map put out by the U.S. Geological Survey gives you an idea of just how far the debris and the tufts and the ash were spewed across the United States, really covering half of the continent. In fact, in Nebraska, we have found woolly rhinoceroses that have been mummified by Yellowstone volcanic ash. Since the first eruption in this area, 2.1 million years ago, again, the volcano has gone off 2 other times. The most recent was 640,000 years ago. And Yellowstone's volcanic activity is often sensationalized by movies in Hollywood. And it is true that it is an active volcano and that it will go off again. It could be today, it could be 10,000 years from now. So for all of our sakes, I hope that it's after our trips to Yellowstone National Park. Leaving behind deep history, I'm going to work quickly into human history and touch a little bit about some of the background of the peoples that inhabited this region. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem was first settled and explored by indigenous Native American tribes as early as 1,000 to 12,000 years ago. But most recently, the tribes that were living in the area were primarily the Shoshone, with the Sheep Eater Band, as well as the Blackfeet to the north. You also had the Gravant, you had the Crow, you had the Bannock, and a number of other tribes that utilized the park's natural resources. I think that we're all moving past that modern myth that the natives did not appreciate or were perhaps superstitious of the hydrothermal activities in Yellowstone. And we've come to recognize that there actually is a lot of archaeological evidence that suggests that these areas were respected and they were revered by the peoples for millennia before any Euro-American contact. This is Chief Washakie, the last great war chief of the Shoshone people, the Eastern Shoshone. Today, the Shoshone are sharing their reservation with the Arapaho just in central Wyoming. Their reservation overlaps a large portion of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And again, the Shoshone were the primary people that were utilizing the Teton Valley and Jackson Hole and working their way up into Yellowstone National Park. And they have an incredible history and saga in that area, a lot of remarkable stories to tell, and some of your guides will share those with you. Now, eventually there was Euro-American contact with the Yellowstone ecosystem, and the first that we are aware of took place by a gentleman named John Coulter. John Coulter was a member of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which set out in the early 1800s, and between 1803, 1804, 1805, the Lewis and Clark Expedition actually passed to the north of Yellowstone. They did not make their way into what is the present-day park. They were 50 miles north, but after finishing a multi-year journey, trekking across the continent and making their way back, one of their hunters, one of their frontiersmen who had joined the company out east by the name of John Coulter, actually decided that he wanted to, instead of heading back to civilization, he wanted to turn around and go straight back into the wilderness. And he became, as historians claim, the first American fur trapper. He followed what was known as the Yellowstone River. Yellowstone National Park gets its name from the river, which is a major tributary to the Missouri River. The Yellowstone River gets its name from the Minotari Indian tribe that referred to the sandstone, the yellow sandstone, sedimentary rocks that were in the riverbanks clear out by the Dakotas. And John Coulter followed the river and basically made his way into present-day Yellowstone National Park and became the first Euro-American to lay eyes on that area. As he came back and intermingled with other Euro-Americans and he told tall tales, trappers in the area, as the legend goes, referred to this place as Coulter's Hell. So before Yellowstone National Park was ever popularized, people referred to Coulter's Hell as the place where brimstone and fire came up out of the earth. This gentleman right here is the famous Jim Bridger. He was a very famous trapper in the area. I know he's been popularized in many novels and movies. Most recently was the one with I forget who the actor was, but they played the character of Hugh Glass, the mountain man who was mauled by a grizzly bear in the movie The Revenant. Jim Bridger was the young boy in that movie, and he was a real character, taller than life, and he and other trappers like Jedediah Smith and Hugh Glass and Davy E. Jackson all lived in and made a living in the Yellowstone, trapping and living off of the land and dealing peacefully with the Shoshone tribe. Well, as the American continent, as North America was being settled and as the United States was expanding, this interior, known as the Intermountain United States, was kind of hostile, and a lot of people were having trouble settling it. The climate was harsh. We had the railroad hadn't yet come through, and as more and more farmers moved and ranchers moved out west, they had some difficulties with Native American tribes. The military was just wrapping things up with the Civil War, and a lot of stories were coming back to the White House in Washington, D.C. about the Yellowstone country, or Coulter's Hell. And finally, enough tall tales were being brought back that the government decided to send out several official expeditions to check out the Yellowstone and see if any of the stories were true, and to also find out if the government could benefit from any of the resources that were supposedly there. So the Washburn expedition headed out, and shortly thereafterwards you had the Hayden Expedition in 1871, set out by the U.S. Geological Survey crew and several naturalists, eventually including George Bird Grinnell, a famous naturalist who was an influence to Theodore Roosevelt. They all came out to Yellowstone and they explored the country, and as the story goes, they did the best thing possible for the region. After surveying what they recognized was a large volcanic surface, they wrote back to the White House and they said, basically, Yellowstone is essentially a worthless area. We can't get anything from this landscape. It's not good for living. It's not good for farming. So therefore, we humbly request and suggest that the government set this area of wonders aside to be a national park. And that's exactly what the government did, thankfully. Because this was Western territories, in the Montana Territory and the Wyoming Territory, there was no state to take this region in as a state park, and therefore it became the world's first national park on March 1st, 1872. We had a lot of incredible promotions of the region by famous painters like Moran and photographers like Jackson, who demonstrated what they had seen by capturing the natural history through their works of art and then shipping them out east. And eventually, Yellowstone National Park began to become quite popular. Again, with the advent of the railroad coming through and creating communities just north of Yellowstone, like in Livingston and as well as Gardner. This is the famous Roosevelt Arch, the northern entrance to Yellowstone National Park, which you'll see on your trip. And tourism became quite popular. People wanted to go out and visit the national park. They wanted to explore what was there. Interestingly enough, and I do point this out just because I think it's just goes to show how new this idea of a national park was. 5 years after the park had become established, there was an Indian war that actually took place inside the park's boundaries. Some of you might recognize this handsome gentleman as Chief Joseph of the Nimipu, or the Nez Perce, as they're frequently called. The Nimipu people lived on the Idaho and Washington and Oregon boundary. And to make a long story short, they were disinterested in being put on a reservation. And so as tensions rose, Joseph, who was just one of many of the tribe's leaders, decided to flee the United States government, and they evaded the U.S. military across 1,700 miles as they fled first to reach the Crow peoples as potential allies out on the Great Plains, and eventually tried to flee toward Canada to meet up with Sitting Bull in hopes of gaining succor there. Chief Joseph and his people actually fled through what is present-day Yellowstone National Park, and they encountered tourists there who were swept up in this tragic Indian war. Tragically, Chief Joseph and his people were actually taken captive and forced to surrender just 40 miles south of the Canadian border. As the park began to grow, it experienced growing pains, which included mismanagement of the natural resources. The park was first created to protect the geologic wonders. So those geysers and hot springs were what interested people most, which is kind of ironic because today we think mostly of Yellowstone National Park as a wildlife sanctuary. But that's not what it was viewed as at first, and people did mismanage the park. Eventually, tourism got a little bit out of hand, and so the military was actually called in to be the first authoritative figure in the national park to patrol the region and to make sure that the laws were being upheld. And most importantly, to stop poaching. Poaching was a huge issue with Yellowstone. When the park was first created, hunting was not forbidden, and people did hunt in the park just like people can fish in the park today. But more and more persecution of wildlife and the fragmentation of collapsing ungulate herds all across the American continent forced the government and the military to recognize that we needed to save this region, not just for its geologic wonders, but also for basically a vignette of preservation for the American West. The bison herds, which ranged between 30 to 60 million across all of North America by the time Lewis and Clark had crossed the plains, had dwindled to just a few handfuls up in Canada, and in the United States there were only, depending on which resource you look at, either 22 or 23 bison left in just a matter of decades. So from 30 million to less than 24 in just a matter of decades is pretty frightening. And sadly, as a resource or as a species becomes more rare, the price and the interest in having something exotic goes up. And so these buffalo heads, these bison heads, were confiscated from a poacher by the US military, who were trying their best to protect Yellowstone's wildlife. This brings me to a very interesting subject, which I'd like to touch on. And your guides are actually going to talk a lot about this. To begin with, I'll read a quote by the author Rick Bass. "It would be so lovely to not have to follow the politics, the laws, the cattle, the humans, the hunters. It would be so lovely to focus on pure, unencumbered biology, foot sizes and body weights, diets, range, and distribution. It would also be fiction." I love that quote because I think in reality, Yellowstone is one of the most complicated ecosystems in the world. And that's because so many people have so much to invest in it. It means so much to so many different people. My family has lived out of the Yellowstone ecosystem for 7 generations. We settled just in the south of Yellowstone in the 1850s. So my family has seen a lot of the Yellowstone legacy evolve over the years, and I have to say that it makes my Sunday dinners at home pretty interesting because we all have different ideas of what should be and what shouldn't be in the Yellowstone area. Predators were not favored by the United States Department of Agriculture for a very long time, and I think for various and obvious reasons. With the collapse of your ungulate herds, your bison, your pronghorn, and your elk, you suddenly had a surplus of carcasses that were littering North America, and the predator population boomed. It grew quite large. And then after the carcasses were all consumed over a matter of years, all that were left were suddenly vast cattle and sheep herds. And predator numbers had skyrocketed, and depredation among ranchers became pretty severe in some locations. And it became a conflict of interest between two organisms, between predators and between humans. And it was actually the government that issued that wolves and cougars be removed out of places like Yellowstone National Park. That can be a little bit of a downer. I don't mean to be a Johnny Raincloud on that subject, but I think it's fascinating that by 1926, when we had trapped our last wolves in Yellowstone National Park and removed them, that 70 years later, it was the same government that issued a reintroduction protocol for Yellowstone's wolves. And I think that that's fantastic. And I think it's very fascinating too. It just goes to show how quickly we can learn. If the very agency that eradicated predators has become their greatest champion in Yellowstone National Park in some respects, I think that that says a lot about how much we are learning and how much we're growing. So as I mentioned, the last wolves in Yellowstone were removed from the park in 1926, were the last documented wolves trapped. But after extensive wildlife management reviews, we began to think as a society that perhaps predators were necessary for the ecosystem, and that perhaps there should be places like Yellowstone where we left things as they were when Euro-Americans first arrived. And with that in mind, we decided to reintroduce wolves. And so in 1995, wolves were trapped up in Alberta, northern Alberta, and the following year in 1996, wolves were live trapped up in Alberta as well as British Columbia, and they were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park as well as central Idaho. I think that sometimes people don't realize that wolves were not only released in Yellowstone, but they were also released in the wildernesses just to the west of the park. And wolves were also coming down into Glacier National Park on their own. So in 2 years, 1995 and 1996, a total of 31 wolves were released in Yellowstone National Park. And 35 wolves were released into Idaho, with a grand total of 66 wolves being brought down and reintroduced into the northern Rocky Mountains. Wolves took off with a little bit of an interesting background and backstory. They were first released in Yellowstone in pens where they were kept to be habituated to the landscape. No one wanted to open up the gates and then have the wolves head straight north into Canada again. That would have been embarrassing. So after a few months of being penned in acre-sized areas and being fed roadkill mostly, the wolves were finally released from their pens and became the population of wolves that we have in the park today. I have an incredible opportunity to research wolves in Yellowstone National Park. I'm a member of the Yellowstone Wolf Project, and these two gentlemen are my supervisors. The one on the right is Doug Smith, the senior wildlife biologist of Yellowstone National Park and the wolf project leader. And the gentleman on the left is Rick McIntyre, who's become quite famous through stories such as American Wolf and other books that have been published on him. The Yellowstone Wolf Project is a part of the government's program to monitor and survey wolves in Yellowstone. And today, from those original 31 wolves, we have a steady population of around 100. That is based on the ecological carrying capacity of the region. So in the northern Rockies, which includes Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, parts of Oregon, a little bit into Washington, There are currently about 1,700 wolves today. So the project was a success. Yellowstone's population, because resources are limited within the park, has a steady population of about 100 wolves, and that fluctuates from year to year. This is a fantastic shot again through the Yellowstone's work with National Geographic. You can see that this wolf here has a collar on it. That's one of the things that we try and do to monitor population sizes and dynamics. Wolves are very volatile. They're territorial in a sense that most other animals are not. Sometimes we use the term territorial loosely. Grizzly bears, for example, they have home ranges. They're not territorial. They won't fight necessarily for their home grounds. They'll overlap. But wolf packs do compete, and they do fight and kill one another for territories. In fact, aside from human mortality rates from humans killing wolves, the number one factor in killing wolves generally is other wolves. Wolves kill wolves, and while they have the opportunity, or the potential, excuse me, to live to about 12 years old, just like a dog, the average lifespan in Yellowstone is only 3 to 5 years for most wolves. And outside of the park, where they're not protected, it's generally 2 to 4 years. So quick, glorious bursts of flame for their life, and then they fight, they live, and then they die and go back into the landscape. Magnificent creatures, though, and we'll talk more about them. Of course, we also have your other megafauna, such as moose. This is a great picture of a bull moose with his velvet on. Moose are members of the deer family, and like all members of the deer family, they grow antlers, these incredible bony extrusions from the head, and every year they shed them and then grow them back again. These antlers in this picture, they're currently covered in it, which is what you'll primarily see on your Yellowstone trips. That velvet is a tissue that's highly vascular and innervated with all of these nerve endings, and they allow these antlers to grow in time for the rut, which takes place in the fall, or the breeding season. Something that is spectacular, particularly with the hidden Yellowstone trips, is the amount of life that is being born. If you show up in May or June all the way through July, you'll see lots of baby animals running around. This is, of course, a picture of a bison. Sometimes we commonly call them buffalo, but the Yellowstone bison have a unique story. As I mentioned, they had dropped down to below 2 dozen, and today we have about 5,000 that are in the park, and that number fluctuates as they leave the park and as management protocols have to monitor that population. But when they're born, which is generally in May or the very end of April, they are born bright red, and we call them red dogs. So this is a beautiful picture of a week and a half, maybe 2-week-old bison calf with its mother. Bison are the largest terrestrial animals in North America. The females are a dainty 1,000 pounds. The males are topping the scales at 2,000. What is really important about Yellowstone National Park is the way that it works as a migration corridor. As I mentioned before, wildlife don't just remain in park boundaries, and we've been discovering just how essential this region is for wildlife that move in and out of the park's boundaries. This is a lovely trail camera that's taken a picture of migrating pronghorn antelope. These are the second fastest land animals on the planet after the cheetah, and they migrate anything from 50 to 150 miles across great expanses of land to get to the ripe locations for feeding and foraging. Of course, we have a coyote population. Coyotes are the little brothers of wolves, a different species. I like to point out, as people look at coyotes, and sometimes from a distance you might think that a coyote is a wolf, but I can promise you that you'll never think that a wolf is a coyote. Coyotes are about 30 pounds in weight, and the average weight of a wolf in Yellowstone is 100 pounds. And the genetic differences, or similarities you could say, between wolves and coyotes are about 94%. And just a little gee whiz information for you. Your DNA and an orangutan's DNA is 94% identical. So you're as closely related to an orangutan as a coyote is to a gray wolf. At this time of year, actually, I was just out today doing some research and collaring of elk because their fawns are about to be born. At this time in the year, and the end of May, the 1st of June, the elk fawns are being born. This is a picture of an elk fawn still in its spots, migrating again up into the higher elevations of Yellowstone National Park. Here's another shot of the pronghorn with, again, the National Geographic survey of wildlife migrations across Wyoming and Idaho and Montana. And of course, as wildlife migrates, it also opens up opportunity for a very dense and rich predator population in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And so we're famous for having all of our intact ecological niches filled. So here we have a grizzly bear that is feeding on a bison carcass, most likely killed from a long winter. And of course, the ravens are all around it. Other ungulates that we have in the area include bighorn sheep. These are rams that are competing, and you might see some of the competing if you go at the very end of our hidden Yellowstone season into September. They begin to compete before the actual breeding season, and they'll crack their heads together. These are magnificent animals that are very prevalent throughout the ecosystem. Here's another picture of elk, of course. This great bull is in its velvet, still growing its antlers. This is how you will see most of your elk. Elk make up about 90% of the wolf's diet in Yellowstone. So while there is a large number of bison on the menu, bison are, like I said, between 1,000 and 2,000 pounds, whereas elk, on the other hand, can range between 500 and maybe 800 pounds. 700 is a typical size for a bull. And that's just an easier meal for the wolves to catch. And they behave differently in terms of a flight or fight response when the wolves are around too. So elk are an important keystone species. Just about everything eats the elk. Again, here's a picture of an elk cow with her 2 fawns. And of course, this is the time of year that you'll see sow bears with their cubs. A sow is a female bear. And in this case, this grizzly has 3 cubs, which is a little bit unusual for grizzly bears. It's more common to see 2. And sadly to say, and this goes for all wildlife, there's about a 50% mortality rate in the first year. But we're rooting for these 3 guys, and we're hoping that they'll stick with mom and they'll grow big and strong and continue to thrive in the Yellowstone ecosystem. We do have 2 species of bear in the Yellowstone ecosystem. There are 3 species of bear in all of North America. Because I work with large predators, I have to throw this pitch in so that everyone gets it straight. Black bears, the American black bear, Ursus americanus, are pretty common throughout all of North America. And then, of course, we have the grizzly bear. The grizzly bear is also known up in Canada and Alaska as the brown bear. The grizzly bear is a whole Arctic species, so it's not just found in North America. You also find it in Scandinavia and Russia. Of course, the third species of bear that we have in North America is not found in Yellowstone, and that is the polar bear. And if you're interested in polar bears, Natural Habitat has a few good polar bear trips that they can hook you up with. But we are happy to have our grizzly bears back and thriving on the landscape. They were wiped out from most of the West. In fact, grizzly bears used to basically live everywhere west of the Mississippi all the way down through Mexico and up into Canada and Alaska. The population, just like the wolves, was exterminated, mostly with bears. It had to do with a lot of habitat loss. These animals require vast tracts of land. And we went from listing the grizzly bear as an endangered species with perhaps 130, 136 animals in the Yellowstone ecosystem to today's population of a conservative estimate of about 700, perhaps all the way up to 1,000 grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. It's good to know how to identify your bears. Claws and the large muscular hump on the grizzly bear are the two best ways to identify from a distance. But sometimes if you can't tell, the best thing to do is to look through your spotting scope and check out those claws. Those huge 4-inch long claws on the grizzly bear are for eviscerating tourists. Actually, I'm just kidding. It's not at all that way. They're for digging. They're like badger claws. And so grizzly bears consume, in the Yellowstone ecosystem, it's about 60 to 70% of their diet is vegetation. So they're digging for tubers and bulbs. Color doesn't matter. This just goes to show, if you look at this bear, you can see that it's got a lack of a hump and its facial profile is slightly pointed. This is actually a black bear. Confusing, right? That right there would be a grizzly bear. Now to talk a little bit about some of the trip's specifics and logistics. This is the only photo I'm afraid I had of our Sprinter vans. That's actually me on the far left-hand side in the red jacket. These are the types of vehicles that you will have access to as we're traveling through the park. And I like this photograph because even though this is a winter picture in Yellowstone, it demonstrates how the hatches can be used. These are Safari Mercedes-Benz Sprinter vans. And when we have safe opportunities to actually stop the vehicle, you can pop up the hatches and get views of the scenery and the wildlife. Natural Habitat Adventures supplies all of the guests with binoculars as well as spotting scopes too, which is essential for really appreciating the wildlife. We always hope to have those incredibly close encounters with animals, but often for the benefit of everyone concerned, the people and the animals, those viewing opportunities actually take place at a bit of a distance, and so it's always good to have Natural Habitat Adventures supply those spotting scopes and binoculars. The vans are very comfortable. Every van allows room for there to be a gap between people sitting at the windows, so everyone gets a window seat and there's room to store your stuff. Very comfortable, very spacious. We rotate the seats. It's a fantastic way to travel throughout the park. These are tentative hotels and lodgings that we stay at during this trip. In Jackson, we stay at the Lexington. This is downtown, about 2 blocks from the historic downtown square where those antlers are, and also about 2 blocks from the famous Cowboy Bar. We also work our way up into Old Faithful. This is the historic Old Faithful Inn. There's also the Snow Lodge Inn. These are historic building sites that were put in, sponsored originally by the railroad and eventually adopted by the Park Service. You are, from this location, you are about 200 yards from Old Faithful. So fantastically adequate for getting private early morning or nighttime views of the eruption. Cooke City is my favorite place to stay. Cooke City is, I grew up in a rural town, and let me tell you what, Cooke City is rural among the rurals. A winter population of about 77 permanent residents. The best place in town to stay at Cooke City is the Super 8, and I actually find it to be very comfortable. The reason why I bring up the Super 8 is because it's not maybe as extravagant and lavish as the Old Faithful Inn, but we choose to stay here because of its proximity to the wildlife. You are out in the middle of the wilderness, and by staying here, we have access to get into the Lamar Valley, to look for wolves, to look for bison and elk herds and grizzly bears. And this is the place to stay if you want to get out and explore early. I believe this is my last slide, and I do like to point out that while Natural Habitat Adventures and the World Wildlife Fund makes this a sincere and very accommodating private trip, this is a national park, and I think that that's something to be celebrated. The fact that we as Americans, but also as a global community sharing this World Heritage Site, as it is designated, we can appreciate Yellowstone. And although I mentioned I grew up 2 miles outside of the national park, this is as much of a park that belongs to everyone as much as it does to me. And there are crowds and it gets busy in certain areas, but Natural Habitat will do a good job of steering clear of those overpopularized sites, and the guides do a good job of protecting the guests' interests. I think it's fantastic that we have the National Park Service and that it's there to accommodate us on our adventures. So I believe that's it. So I'll just put this back on the picture of the grizzly bears because it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that picture. I'm rooting for them too. They are just terrific. So, questions for you that we've gotten so far, Aaron. We have a question about the vans. How many people do the vans hold?
Good question. So we have 7 people per van. So the vans actually hold, if I can do the math quick, I think they're 12 passenger vans. So everyone, and that includes the 7th person is the driver, which is a guide. So everyone gets lots of room and everyone gets a window seat.
Hmm. Okay, good. Um, what are the chances of seeing wolves?
Um, it depends, and I'm going to be honest with you. I my job is to track and research wolves, and wolves are notoriously evasive of people. So seeing them close up is very difficult, but seeing them from afar in the Lamar Valley, the odds are pretty good in your favor. I don't want to play favorites with dates, but it does become more difficult to spot wolves the later the summer advances, just because it gets hot and the wolves move up into the higher timbered areas where it's cooler. There is no guarantee, but I have had a pretty good span of luck when it comes to seeing wolves on these trips, and I would say it's probably an 80 to 90% chance of success.
Okay, that's cool. Thanks. Um, so, what about in early September? What sort of wildlife are you likely to see then?
Oh my goodness, that is my favorite time of year. What's exciting about that is the park starts to calm down after the summer months, um, and the temperatures start to drop. And as the temperatures start to drop, all sorts of things happen. The leaves change colors, the frost comes out, and also this is the breeding season for a lot of your deer species and actually all of your ungulates. So in September, you have the elk that are bugling. If you've never listened to an elk bugle, look it up. It sounds pretty great. It's like a Lord of the Rings Nazgul screaming. But the elk start to bugle. They're competing. The moose are sparring. They're fighting. You have the bighorn rams that are knocking their heads together. The grizzlies and the black bears they're experiencing what we call hyperphagia. So they're very active because they're trying to put on weight before winter comes. So it's a good time of year to go in September.
Okay, good. Thanks. Um, how far away are the wolves in Lamar Valley when they are spotted? So, are you getting an up close experience or is this a binocular type experience?
It is a binocular type experience. We have had them close enough to the road that you can see them with the naked eye, and you can see them with the naked eye, but to really be satisfied, we're talking about binoculars and scopes. If you've never been to the Lamar Valley, the reason why it's so famous for seeing wolves is because of how open it is. The rest of the park is very thickly wooded. It doesn't mean that there aren't wolves in the rest of the park. On the contrary, there's just as many in the rest of the park as in Lamar, but Lamar is just so open and breathable that you can see the wolves, but sometimes that does come at a distance price. So looking through binoculars and scopes is generally what you're doing to see the wolves, which is
Mm,
how we want it. If the wolves are too close to people, then they become habituated. And when they become habituated, then they either get hit by cars or they start to threaten things or people starting to threaten them in the wrong way.
mm, okay, makes sense. Thank you. All right, so we've talked a lot about your view on best time to go and that sort of thing. We have some listeners who've actually gone twice. They've done a fall trip and a winter trip. They're looking for a third trip. If they want to see young animals but avoid insects, is there a sweet spot there for that?
Um, no, I feel your pain. The mosquitoes, thankfully on this trip, we call this a front country trip, you are avoiding a lot of the mosquitoes. Um, I would say probably the best time to go would be late May, when it's still a little bit too cool for the mosquitoes to be out, and your babies are being born, but there's no guarantee. I'm afraid that when the baby animals are born, that means the baby mosquitoes are born simultaneously.
Got it. Okay. Well, that makes sense too. So thank you. Okay. So I am going to stop there then and turn it back over to you for closing comments. And for those asking for the replay, we will get that out to you by about this time tomorrow. So I'll turn it
Fantastic.
back to you. Yep.
Thank you.
Mhm.
In closing, I'll just say that Yellowstone's ecosystem it's a precious treasure. And as I mentioned already, it's an international treasure. It's spectacular. And I hope that as you look into experiencing Yellowstone, you look beyond some of its iconic features like the geysers and like the wolves and the grizzly bears, and you actually see the ecosystem working together in tandem. People who come on these trips, they maybe start Yellowstone as a bucket list item, but as they leave, they hopefully come with a new appreciation and they understand a little bit more about not only how the Yellowstone ecosystem is so tightly interwoven, but they begin to appreciate just how the ecosystems closer to home actually work. And I've been fortunate to have grown up and worked in Yellowstone my entire life, and I'm excited for everyone to check it out.
Well, thanks again so much for being with us today, Aaron. We loved it, and everyone is sending in all kinds of great compliments, which we will make sure that we review all the wonderful comments and any unanswered questions. We will make sure that we review all of those. And with that, we will say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.